age my dad was in that picture. And that is my boyfriend at the time. My dad wrote me a letter, and he was having kind of a midlife crisis. And I want to read you something I wrote about the letter so I don't get off topic. After the election, I began reflecting on how the documents, oral histories, patterns, and images created by our families, communities, and political or religious institutions are endlessly complicated and often contradictory in their perspectives and what they present. You can create almost any narrative you want from their open weave of light and dark, past and present, true and false, joy and tragedy. One generation lays their pictures, their texts, their experiences over the next, and we pull the remnants we wish to be true into focus and let others fade, only to see the next generation choosing different threads to strengthen or cut. My father wrote me a letter when I was 19 years old. It's a 4-page letter, and he tells me on every page that he loves me. He also tells me on every page what a disappointment and heartbreak I've been to him. He wrote the letter while on a road trip he took himself on in the midst of a midlife crisis. He was about the age I am now. It was shortly after I'd moved in with my boyfriend, and in his mind, we were living in sin. The letter is clear evidence of a man who loves his daughter as deeply as any father can. It's also evidence of a man struggling to keep his beloved patriarchy in place at all costs, even the cost of a beloved child. At one point he says, I am more like him than any of his children. But he goes on to lament that I'm a girl, and I must play by the rules that have been determined. My most valuable asset is my chastity, and without it, I'm a leftover, and no man will want me. This is how you end up with an unapologetically misogynist president of the United States of America. You justify oppression with love. I love my father. I love him more than any daughter could love a father. So I made this. My dad turns 90 this year. We've been arguing about this letter since I was 19. The man in that picture is my husband and the father of my 3 children. So I started to think about how generations weave themselves into each other and how we pass down information, and how sometimes the information is very confusing and you can't sort it out. You're getting mixed messages. Somebody's telling they love you, and they're telling you you shouldn't go to college. They're telling you opposite things at once. So also, I started thinking about how these family stories come up at different points in your lives and mean different things. This is my Uncle Ralph. My Uncle Ralph, who was 6'7", was a bomber pilot. He lied about his height so he could get into that position, which killed him because he was too big to get out of the plane. He got everyone else out of the plane, and he went down over Austria. This is his plane. This photograph was taken by a news photographer who happened to be in a plane near his plane. He was out on a particular trip. They shot out one of the engines, and he did not die on this trip. He flew another 4 hours to safety on this particular trip, went back out, and was eventually killed. What you see in the gallery as that wall of documents there, this is one of them. It's a letter from the War Department. I only included a couple of pages. Essentially what it says here, there's different commanders and people who are writing. One commander's very sweet and telling them he's so sorry. One is very much like that's telling me that I'm still yammering. One of them is very much about being like we're going to intern the body, and this is the pragmatics of the situation. And one of them is describing what they found, which is a body strewn across a field, and it was decapitated. And I was thinking about how that story has affected our family, how it affected my dad, how we think about war, what we think about soldiers. This is my grandmother. My grandmother wanted to be a dancer. She's the one in the middle. She also wanted to be a lawyer, but that was not a choice for her. She turned out to be a teacher. This is her baptism certificate. This is a letter from her father that she kept. Her last name was Love. This is a telegram from my grandfather to my grandmother. And dear Doris, please accept the day's greetings with love, Herbert. That's as warm as it got. And that is a true story. That says so much because that's exactly how they acted toward each other. This was a secret Valentine from someone else. This is the receipt for her wedding bouquet. She got married to the one she did not love the best. This is my aunt, and I tell this story, I'm getting close to the end. This is my Aunt Marjorie, who looks almost identical to my mother. But of course, I grew up with my mother, not my Aunt Marjorie. And my mother was very different than me, very quiet, kind of passive person. And my Aunt Marjorie, when I was a kid, all I knew from her was troublemaker. We don't talk to her. We don't know where she is. That's all I knew. As my mother started going through the 70s and changing her own life a little bit, she got back in touch with my aunt. By my late 20s, the story had changed. And my Aunt Marjorie married a man who was not of the same faith, so she was cast out from the family. After she was cast out, what happened was the man was a monster, and he beat her and her children. So she had to leave him. And she was a single mother with 2 kids who'd been cast out of her family. Then she went on to get her English degree as an undergraduate. And after that, she went on to get her degree in psychology, her master's degree. And after that, she went on to get her pilot's license. And she ended up living the rest of her days in a little town just north of here at the mouth of Yosemite, where you can pull your plane up to the back of your house. So she was an amazing person. And when I met her, the whole time I kept thinking, I don't know where I come from. I'm a lot like my dad, but we're so different in our ideas. And then I finally met my Aunt Marjorie, who looked exactly like my mother, who I looked like. And all of a sudden, I realized part of this story had just been married. I was definitely from this side of the family. I was definitely part of the family. I just didn't know that part of the family existed. And this is how families work. You take a piece of the history you want, you give it to the person who needs it. I don't tell my 9-year-old all the stories. You pick and choose the history that you want to create for your family or for your child. And so I started to put these documents together, and I was thinking about how one history overlaps another and you see through them, and how they change each other a little bit, and how they can be reordered and changed and bigger or smaller, but they're transparent. And they're untrustworthy because they change all the time. And then this is the piece that's in the gallery now, and you see the pillow here, which is about love, and it's a terrible Van Halen song. Did you guys recognize it? Any of you guys? Jump? Which I didn't actually like Van Halen when I was in high school, but it came back to me later. And it's a very, I like when you can take a thing that's very common and very universal in some ways, people familiar, people know it, and you change it enough that people can see it again in a new way. And if you just listen, so the actual recording is 2 tracks. One is the keyboard track slowed down, so it's kind of sounds like it's underwater a little bit. And the other is the vocal track, David Lee Roth just same, trying to keep up, it feels like he's almost trying to pull the other one along with him. But if you listen to the words, they're actually kind of profound in this weird way. And he talks, the line that kills me every time is, I'm not the worst that you've seen. And I love the idea that the secret Valentine and this missed love and this guy like, come on, I'm here, I'm by the jukebox, I'm not that bad, you should take me. And thinking about how we pass our relationships on to our children, our parents pass them to us, how your great-grandmother's relationship is affecting you in some way because of what you were told or what you were allowed or what information you were given. So that's what this piece is about. And if you notice, there's also a lighting app that was made by this genius right here. And I am so grateful. And the lighting changes from warm to cool to suggest the passage of time. And how things are always this cyclical changing, and they always change the perspective that you see things in. The last thing I'll talk about is the plaid, which you see in there. And this is the big idea. So it goes from the personal to the political, kind of in this case. My dad was very proud of being a Campbell. And we go to the Scottish Games. He was the head of the Clan Campbell of the United States for like a big chunk of years. He knows the Duke of Argyll. He thinks it's very awesome. I think it's awesome. But a short, abbreviated Scottish history will tell you that the Campbells were essentially loyalists to the British Crown. They sold the Highlanders out to become part of the British Isles. And this is the Campbell tartan. This is MacDonald tartan. My mother's a MacDonald. The MacDonalds were the Highlanders. They were the people who wanted to stay autonomous. They wanted to be Scottish. They didn't want to be British. And the Campbells slaughtered them. The Campbells not only slaughtered them, the Campbells were being housed at their castle and fed and clothed and sheltered for 5 days, and then they slaughtered them. So it's a pretty dark history. And again, you can choose who you want to be. Do you want to be a Campbell? Do you want to be a MacDonald? And we see it all the time. You see white supremacists who aren't even white, who genetically, who just choose to look at one side of their family, who just choose to ignore their Mexican grandmother or something. I think it's interesting, but it's also dangerous and important right now. So it leads to paintings that I'm doing coming up. I'm thinking a lot about plaid and how it's changed over time and how symbols and patterns change over time. This is 30s, 40s, 50s plaid. This is 70s plaid. Changes. All of a sudden, it's like kind of a little bit naughty, right? Like you're kind of like, you got a different kind of power in the 70s, 80s. All of a sudden, plaid goes from being the most conforming to the least conforming people in, this is Johnny Rotten, this is Vivienne Westwood, this is punk rock. And then the 90s, Kurt Cobain, grunge, heroin, chic, it changes over time. The Campbells were thinking one thing. I don't think they were thinking this. But it got usurped because the context changed and all kinds of things changed. This is another example of how a powerful symbol can be usurped and changed, and information can be coded or put in a certain way, and people can take a totally different meaning out of it. You have the Nazis using a symbol for one thing, and the Hindus using it for the complete opposite. And this is my last slide. These are my Campbells. These are my people. And I show this because I still have that pride. I still want to tell that story. But I think it's so important to think about how the story is told. And how do I change pride? How do I pass it down without it being nationalism? How do I be careful about the letter that I write these kids? Because undoubtedly I will. And how do you guys all do that? It's an important question for us all right now, I think. And that's my lecture. I went a little over, but I'm happy to answer questions if you're still with me. Technical, anything? Yeah.
You hit a nerve, and
Okay.
the nerve is Donald John Trump.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, you have tremendous facility. Your art is excellent. It's beyond excellent. I just love everything. I look at your work and I look at the facility, the brushstrokes, the looseness, and it drives me crazy. And I tell myself, why can't I do that? And then I think, with such facility, you could render a huge major protest about this idiot in the White House. Do you have plans to do that at all, or address that issue?
Well, in my own way, I feel I am. I mean, I'm doing this huge body of work, which is my particular issue, which is the treatment of women in the art world. And the thing about, well, I do a lot of practical things. I protest, I went to Washington, I do all of that stuff, I make awesome protest posters. I should have a whole thing on the protest posters. But this is the thing about making propaganda, which is what you're asking, in some ways. I came from a place that was all about making images, making your whole life support a certainty, right? And I went to art because art was able to, I'll use this example. You know, Macbeth is a good example. Lady Macbeth is kind of detestable, right? Like, she made bad choices. She kind of deserved her fate in a way. But when you get almost to the end of the play and she's looking at her hands and out, down, spot, you realize that Macbeth is a lot worse than her. And you feel her pain and you think, wow, you were greedy. You made some bad choices. And the art is not about, don't vote for Macbeth. You know what I mean? The art is about human fallacy and the fact that we are weak and the fact that we make bad decisions and end up in places that we don't even think we're going to end up. So for me, I like to separate the heavy-handed, direct kind of criticism from my actual practice. Not that I don't do the other, but I think politics are different than art. And a lot of people disagree with me, and they do social practice. And I am not a social practice artist. I'm a painter. I'm a maker of things that usually provoke questions. They're usually pretty pointed questions. You can see I'm pretty opinionated. But I don't like them to be closed in terms of, like, I'm not a Daumier. I wouldn't do political cartoons because I think they're too reductive. I mean, I'm interested in doing a painting of Donald Trump in terms of how he ended up there. I mean, I'm very fascinated at all the people who put him there and what terrible tragedy would happen to a person that would, I'm interested in my dad. I've had this conversation with my dad many times. He can, on one side of his face, say, you are more like me than anyone in my family. You get me. And I'm going to buy you a car instead of a college education because a woman needs transportation, not education. So I'm looking at him, and it's complicated how he ended up there, right? It's complicated, and that's the picture I want to make. But I also, in other conversation, I mean, I proselytize. I'm a missionary too. I go out, I knock on doors, I call, I do voter registration, but I don't see art as that. Yeah.
At what point did you break free from kind of the fragility of, like, religious, like, family standards and, like, go your own path and, like, embrace freedom instead?
It started, I don't know that there's a point. I had always had questions. I was about 16 probably. I had a particular experience where I had a bunch of questions, and there was a meeting where they were answering questions, and I just kept having questions, and the person who was running the meeting said, I'll talk to you later. And then I talked to them later, and they said, I think their words were, have you prayed? And I said, yes, I have been praying for months and months. I'm that person. And they said, what answer did you get? And the particular thing I was asking in my prayers was, why can't women have the priesthood? And he said, well, what answer did you get? And I said, that women should have the priesthood. And he said, well, then you prayed in the wrong spirit. And I realized at that point that the game was rigged. For me, I figured at that moment I wasn't going to be able to pray right, whatever that meant. So I wandered my way to I went through a bunch of other really interesting and equally as complicated beliefs after that. that I also am not involved in now. You know, I went to a very extreme form of feminism